I have been following you on LinkedIn and have been so excited about the things that I've been learning from you. It really seems like at the core of your work is redistributing power. That feels like so fundamental. And so for today's conversation, I want to focus on how to read and see and begin to redistribute power within our organization so that we can create truly multiracial and multicultural organizations and institutions. So
Mhm.
thank you so much for having this conversation with me. It's a real honor to get to talk.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so excited to have a chat.
Great. So, my first question is, what is power?
So, I really subscribe to one part of Alicia Garza's definition of power being the ability to control my life and the ability to have an impact on the lives of other people. I believe that the ability to control my life and influence the lives of other people is determined by access to a set of levers, access to money, access to information, access to audience, access to decision makers, to community, and decision making rights. The ability to move, create, or diminish that ability to change my life and other people's lives is what power is, which is why we feel such disproportionate power imbalance right now, because you have a lot of very rich billionaires who have essentially purchased with their money the way that the rest of us experience access to information, access to an audience, access to community, access to decision makers, and access to decision making rights.
I'm going to put a link to The Purpose of Power by Alicia Garza in the show notes.
Yeah, that'd be
That was
great.
really a fundamental book for me, also in
Yeah,
understanding power.
yeah, it's pretty an
And
incredible book.
I appreciate you naming just how skewed the power is to this very small portion of people. And the redistribution of power that must happen on this collective social
Yeah.
global sphere. What called you to start to rethink your own relationship with power as a leader and to really center this relationship with power and how you do your work?
Yeah. Well, I would say that I really had a fantasy about power for a long time, and a fantasy that was really enabled by segregation
Hmm.
because I was, first generation, low income Latina. I had been on the losing end of power distribution, but had been able to have enough tools and supports and resources that I was able to do a class shift, right? Like I went to college, got a
Hmm.
job, and I went from being low income to being middle class over the first few years of my career. And because of that, I had always had this identity as like, I come from a poor community, I'm Latina, like I haven't had power. And I was in organizations that were predominantly white, or they were snow capped, which means that everyone who had consequential decision making power in the institution was white, and everyone else was people of color. And I and a lot of the people I worked with had this imagination that if we were truly multiracial, multicultural institutions, then everything would be much better. And there were two experiences. One, I was a community fellow through Marshall Gantz's class at Harvard,
Hmm.
and he asked us to evaluate when was the last time we experienced the identity that we tell people when we do our introductions. And it was in that moment that I was like, oh, wow, I'm a middle class person with middle class resources. And
Hmm.
I'm still talking about myself as if I come from a poor community, which, listen, like generationally, I do, culturally, I do.
Yeah.
I have a lot of understanding of that world, but it has been a full decade at that point in time. And then about 5 years later, I became an executive for the first time and at a multiracial, multicultural institution. I had grown so tired of fighting to get representation at all levels of an institution and had had this opportunity to work for an organization that was specifically focused on the integration of the tech industry for Black and Latina people. And it was fully multiracial, right? Like
Mm,
at every layer and level. I define a multiracial, multicultural institution as one that is at least 20% people of color at every layer and level of the institution, and at least 40% women and femmes at every layer and level. And that is not common in our economy at all. It was the
mm,
hardest thing I've ever done because all of the systems we were using were culturally inherited from segregated institutions. If I was going to use something from the Society of Human Resource Management or the Harvard Business Review or Stanford Social Innovation Review, which you're bound to do, by the way, when you're running something, because you cannot create everything at once.
right.
You need tools from other places. But when I would bring in those tools, there would be a cultural blow up in the institution, right? And when I asked people who had had power, they would be like, doing the people are never happy, you're doing as
Right.
good as you can. And it just didn't feel like a complete answer to me. And so really started to think about what is power? How do I walk my team through having it and distributing it? And not the fantasy of power that I had grown up in, but actual power and what it's like to manage it now
Mm.
that we had it.
You mentioned that these tools from the Harvard Business Review, the Stanford Innovation Review, et cetera, that they are rooted in this segregationist ideology stance. Can you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. The way power travels in America culturally, not like there's a rule book somewhere, but
Right.
it's kind of the osmosis that we all breathe, is that you have to insulate the most powerful and distribute risk to the most vulnerable. That is always the smartest business decision. And that is a descendancy of slavery and the way that we started our original economic engine and the cultural norms that enabled at every stage of our history a distribution of risk to the most vulnerable people.
Can you give an example of that? Like, what
Yeah.
does it look like now or
Yeah.
historically to insulate those with power?
So I'll start with the distributing of risk, right? Say something like a severance policy. People don't normally have a severance policy. It's not like everyone is guaranteed an amount of money when they leave an organization, which is not normal in other countries. So, like in France, there's something like 6 months of notice that you get if you're going to transition out of a job. And in Japan, you're guaranteed a certain amount of money the day that you are fired for or laid off from a job.
Wow.
In Brazil, they have severance policy rules that are at a national level. Like, it's not the way other countries work, but we have decided that the people who get fired or laid off are an acceptable sacrifice
Mm,
in order for the company and the executive not to take on the financial burden of doing some kind of transition payment,
got it.
right? And if you are running a company or a nonprofit organization or an initiative of some kind where people are getting paid, if you go to someone and you ask them, like, oh, what should I do? This person is not meeting expectations, or actually, this person is causing havoc inside the institution. Everyone you go to is going to tell you, oh, you've got to fire them. You got to cauterize that wound. And they will tell you, like, you have no legal obligation to them because they are an at will employee,
Right.
right? So it feels very countercultural as a CEO if you are to say, actually, if you've worked here for a year, you get 12 weeks of severance.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's under a year, it's prorated 12 weeks of severance for every week or month that you have been here, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when you do that, people like board members, lawyers, funders, investors will say that you are taking unnecessary risks with the cash flow of the company. Because as a culture, we have accepted that an individual should carry the risk of employment and that the executives or the institution, which are significantly more powerful, should not carry that risk. And that's like one example. But if you look at our policies for the way we manage labor in America, it's a pretty consistent pattern in the way we do it. And it feels almost like you're being bad if you don't do it that way.
Mm.
Not smart, quote unquote, as a CEO to do it that
And so when you were leading this organization, were you coming up against that, trying to make changes? Tell me
way.
more about what
Yeah.
happened there.
So when I took over this organization, there was a cash deficit. I was taking over at a very tumultuous time. There were these complicated decisions of like, we could maybe make it to the end of the year. But if we do, we will have launched a set of things that are going to cost more money and we won't be able to make it as far then. I could see certain things slowing down in the market or what have you. So I knew that in addition to having a $3 million gap in our budget, as much as we could cut down on that, like we would still be in a place where we'd have to do a layoff. Everyone told me that you give 2 weeks of severance to people that you are laying off. And I knew I was going to be the villain in a lot of people's stories in that
Mm-hmm.
moment, right? With every right. People had every right to be upset, right? They had a job and then they didn't. But I knew not only was I going to be hurting those people in a way that would make economic devastation in their lives, I was also going to be sending a message to my team about their own value within the organization. So I came back to the board and said, hey, like, I'm going to give everyone 12 week severance. They said to me, like, we would advise against that. You need as much cash as possible in order to continue to run the organization. You should do less than that. And I was like, is that a recommendation? Is that a command?
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, it's a recommendation. And I was like, sweet. So we're going to give everyone 12 week severance. But I made the decision and did it with a shaking hand, right? I was talking about the livelihoods of other people who are going to stay in the organization. I was talking about programming that was helping young people. It was not like it was a no risk choice, right? However, I thought the risks to the organizational culture and the risks to those individuals were just going to be higher if I didn't do that.
Mm.
There's a list of things much like that that you experience as you're moving along decision making.
You shifted the risk from those employees that you could no longer afford to keep on for long term. You shifted the risk of being laid off from them and took on a significant part of that.
Yeah.
What happened next?
I mean, we laid off a third of the organization. Another third decided to leave because I said, if you can't stay here after this, I want you to have the emotional economic freedom to be able to do that. And so you will work to the end of the month and get 8 weeks severance. And then I was left with 1/3 of the organization to run the organization itself. And it was hard. It was hard for a while. And then we recovered in a way that kept people whole that I honestly don't know would have been possible
Yeah.
culturally had I made a different choice. And to be clear, members of my executive team were recommending to me, like, actually, these people should get this much severance. And so it wasn't just me making the call,
Okay.
like it was the people that we had in power also pushing for that. Part of the reason my work focuses on multiracial, multicultural institutions is the social capital runs so differently. And I call them MRMCs because I
Mhm.
find that we don't have a good name for multiracial, multicultural institutions. In an MRMC, you are faced with a group of people who is going to be like, hey, why would you make that choice? Where did that trade off come from? A group of diverse people do not accept their fate as fait accompli in the
Mm.
same way that a group of homogenous people do. You change the power dynamics inside of the institution by creating something different with social capital. And I find that in a homogenous institution, you just don't have enough friction there. You can choose the easiest road and not pay a lot of consequences for it in a homogenous institution.
You write a lot about how there's two seismic shifts that have
Mhm.
occurred in the last several decades, the demographic shift and then the digital revolution that have changed the distribution and challenged the status quo
The
distribution order.
distribution of power,
Right. Yeah.
yeah.
Can you share more about how these shifts are
Yes,
impacting? Yeah.
absolutely. I'll talk about the digital revolution first. It used to be that if you were going to get access to power, money, information, audience, community, decision makers, decision making rights, it all came in a package. And you only really got power from institutions. The majority of power came from institutions, work, church, the soccer league, the civic organization, whatever it was. You came into a space and you made trade offs the way the people with the most power made trade offs. You thought about and handled money decisions the way the people with power did. And then you would be given a little bit more power, but it was the whole package, right? You got
Mhm.
more access to information, more access to money. It was all wrapped up together. And then the internet happened. And all of a sudden, you can gain access to one of those levers of power without having access to all of them, which I think was really confusing for people. And you could see that quite a bit on social media. People thought if you had a big audience, then that must mean you had money. But those two things were not
Mm.
corollary, right? Um, but I have a disability. I have long COVID, and I got sick with COVID in March of 2020, in the first wave of people that got sick, and I was in bed for a year. And then I was not getting better.
Mm.
And I went online and I found a community of people who were also not getting better. Right. And with those people, we organized to make the World Health Organization
Mm.
acknowledge that this was not just a 2 week, 3 week disease. And we went into accessed information in medical journals, even though none of us were doctors, because doctors were telling us it was all in our heads and it was anxiety. It wasn't like something that was happening to us physically. But all of a sudden, I didn't need a medical journal. And, I think the way that doctors often handle that is like, oh, WebMD is ruining the patient experience or what have you. But actually, it's about patients having a level of power that
Yeah.
they did not have before inside of the doctor's office, and traditional power structures not knowing how. So all of a sudden on the internet, you did not need to assimilate in order to gain power. It was not about how much you could prove. You were alike to the people who already had power. In
Mm.
fact, disruption and anger and a good storyteller that helped you stick out in the crowd actually were how you got power. And the digital revolution, as that happened and power was being distributed to other people, it changed how people interacted with power internally as well within organizations and
Yeah.
institutions. And I think there are a lot of blame that it's like labor is too woke now.
Or it's Gen Z.
Absolutely. It was very
Hmm.
blamed on generational, which it's not completely wrong that it's a generational shift. It
Hmm.
absolutely is a generational shift because the way that you and I learn to type, we learn through AIM or our text messages.
Yeah.
We learned to type through osmosis. And now a generation of people is learning about power through osmosis. But the problem is that the internet was architected by young white men in their mid 20s to mid 30s. They had never known harm a day in their life. And they used disruption to not have to follow civil rights law, to not have to follow labor law, to not have to follow financial laws for a
Right.
really long time. Facebook, for instance, had it so that you could advertise your real estate only to certain populations, breaking breaking
Hmm.
laws that we've had in this country for some
Hmm.
time. And disruption is one tool for gaining power, but when you come inside of institutions, disruption is not going to do everything, right? It's a hammer nail situation, and the whole world looks like a nail when all you have is a hammer. So you have to help people understand what power is and how they're wielding it, because the digital revolution has created a set of different stakes. Now, simultaneously, the people most familiar with that revolution were a much more diverse generation of people, right? All of a sudden, we were going from being a majority minority population in the United States to being a plurality. And that was freaking out everyone, in particular, the white men who held the most decision making power in the country. And as I said about institutions, once you don't have a homogenous institution or a majority minority institution, power changes inside of it. And America never learned how to share power across difference. The lack of proportional representation in all our major industries, tech, education, media, healthcare, put our economy and our democracy in the most vulnerable position humanly possible in the middle of a demographic shift. Because the folks with the most consequential decision making power were trying to stop the rise of power that was happening more broadly across the United States.
Yeah.
Those two things are crashing into each other and causing massive amounts of disruption and massive amounts of destruction as the people with the most power use every possible avenue to keep the power they have.
So my mind goes to, okay, Carla, what do we do on a more systemic global scale? Like, I can know what I do as a city councilor here in Greenfield and which levers I'm able to pull in my little
Yeah.
rural town. And also, I'm sure that people hear you say that and are like, okay, so what do we do? I'm curious how
Yeah.
you've been answering that question
Oh, yeah.
yourself
Oh,
recently.
yeah. Um, so I actually think part of the problem is we always think about it as global systemic and not local.
Okay.
I
Uh,
was doing a speech in front of a bunch of political scientists a few months ago, and I asked the room of highly educated people, how many of you have experienced democracy inside of an institution that you have worked with or for that is dedicated to multiracial, multicultural democracy? And 3 people of 40 raised their hand. And I was like, this is a highly educated room where these topics are top of mind all of the time.
mm,
And only 3 people raised their hand, which means to me that a bunch of people across the country, their day-to-day experiences of organizations are authoritarian experiences. There may be a benevolent dictator and you have a better experience. But even when people try to wrestle with all of this, when things get real crazy, when things get real wild, they're like, okay, it's time to buckle down and make this happen. And buckle down always means go authoritarian, right?
Mm.
And when I say experience of democracy, everyone thinks what I mean is like organizations run by consensus, which again, I think is an indicator that we have not had many experiences of democracy because that's not how democracy runs.
Hmm.
It's actually that one, you have an experience of rights that exist no matter how much favor you curry with someone in leadership or power in your institution. It is an equitable distribution of power and an understanding of where power rests across the organization. So, who has decision making rights for what? And at what level does each decision making right rest? And how can we distribute decision making rights in a way that more people are getting access to that and access to decision makers in order to make those decisions? And then the third thing is an experience of accountability and repair. Like the biggest pushback I get around my work is like, well, can't we just say that like integration didn't really work? In really genuine ways, people in communities who have been hurt are like, there's just no way to do this. I'm just like, that's because we never experienced integration. We experienced assimilation. And if you have accountability and repair, it's just a very different experience. And so I think those three things are necessary inside of institutions. And that gives people the skills to share power.
For folks who are listening and maybe like, wait, what did you just
Yeah.
say? Integration never happened, assimilation happened. Can you kind of define that?
So we have an apartheid economy, right? For people of color in particular, after the $60,000 mark, you watch a bleed of people out of the workforce. So the majority of people of color are stuck in jobs that are making less than $60,000 a year and have very few consequential decision making rights. And that means we exist in an apartheid economy, much more white men who have that consequential decision making power and are
Mm-hmm.
determining the way power moves inside of an institution. And that also means that most of us go to work and experience a lack of decision making authority over our own lives. And it creates situations in which people are forced to assimilate to a certain way of being and forced to enact certain modes of operating, even when they have power, or they lose their power, which is coercive,
Yeah.
right? And we have not had the experience of integrating our institutions in a way that distributes power across our entire populace.
You said that enacting democracy within our organizations has three components. People have rights no matter how much power they have. There's an equitable distribution of power and an understanding of who holds what
Yeah.
power. And third, systems of accountability and repair. So let's unpack each of those. First, rights. What are rights? And what
Uh,
does it mean for people to have them no matter how much power they hold within an
yeah.
organization?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the work that I do with institutions that I work with is like help them create a set of foundational documents. One is a beliefs document, like what are the beliefs of this institution, not each of the individuals in the institution, but as a collective, what do you believe about this issue?
Mm-hmm.
Because then you can say, here are the trade offs we are willingly making as an institution and a talent philosophy that's like, what are our beliefs about management here? That allows you to create, like, what are the commitments the institution makes to its employees? And what is the employee expected to commit in return? Because there are trade offs in any collective. If I want to be a solo operator, then I don't have a lot of responsibilities to a collective, right? I am just working for myself and I don't have to make a lot of trade offs when it comes to who I want to work with, what I want to work with, short of financial limitations.
Mm.
But in a collective, we all make a trade off to be a part of it, right? And I find that if an institution is clear about what commitments it is making to its team, that allows people to say, here I am protected in these ways, right? Like there will always
Mhm.
be a process that I will go through that is a fair and equitable process. Right? I get fired here, I will always get this kind of severance. COLA is always guaranteed for me for the, like, in these situations. The conditions that the institution creates and how do you codify them so that you are able to depend on something,
Yeah.
right? Like people need to be able to rest into something. And most of our institutions have very little you can rest into. And that means we're not getting the best of what people can give
Mhm.
because they're always making decisions where economic manipulation or devastation could be the other side of that. So those rights are really critical.
So many people talk about how trust is so important to navigate conflict,
Yeah.
and it is. And so often people focus at the interpersonal level of trust and how we communicate.
Yes.
But these systems, these clear commitments from an organization are really, like you said, rest back into to feel like
Yeah.
someone has our back, that we're not burdened by the risk of the organization, helps
Yeah.
us to then lean in and soften or, show up
Yes.
in the more interpersonal or team
Yeah.
conflicts in a way that might be generative.
To make decisions where there are trade offs
Right.
and feel like that isn't going to be the end of me.
Right. Yeah. And how about when you say equitable distribution of power and you say an understanding of how power is held? I kind of see those as separate, but I heard you say them together. And I'm curious
Yeah.
if you could
Yeah.
talk about each and both.
It's not equitable if you do not know where it rests.
Uh huh. No.
Right? Like it's just, I can't tell you how many organizations I've worked with or have experienced where no one knows who gets to make the choice. Decision making rights work is so important at the institutional level for people to be clear about that. And there's something that I call a bridge decision making. In a homogenous institution, if there's a gap of some kind, often people will go fill that gap because that is a way that they can absorb power. In a multiracial, multicultural institution, no one wants to be seen as a power hoarder. And so those gaps stay until someone is assigned often to those
Mm.
things. And there are just decisions in an institution that impact several departments. And those decisions often get tossed around like a hot potato. And any decision that gets tossed around like a hot potato usually ends up in the hands of a person one or two levels up because no one wants to make the choice. And if you do really good decision making work, then one, you identify the decision making rights that rest across the organization. Anyone can go and look and be like, oh, Catherine is in charge of that. Let me go talk to Catherine about how I'm being impacted by this, right?
Mm.
Or, oh, I see a really big opportunity. Let me go talk to Catherine about what I think we could do here, right? A bridge decision maker is someone who is in charge of making a decision that impacts several different departments or groups, not just them and their immediate scope of influence. If it's a decision that rests across several different departments or several different groups, then every bridge decision maker should have a set of responsibilities they are required to make in order to honor the way that it impacts a lot of different people.
When you say that we cannot equitably share power without understanding who holds it, what I
Yes.
think is it's not necessarily that it's a completely flat organization that everyone
Yeah,
has the same
not at
amount
all.
of power. No, it's
No.
that when we are clear about who holds power, where it lies, then we can be in conversation effectively and sharing and understanding how we're sharing a decision making the
Yes.
making of a decision or not.
Well, the
Okay.
reason that I say that access to decision makers is a lever of power is because the people who form the context of a person who makes a decision have power. So
Yeah.
then your calendar, like if you are a person with power, your calendar is a vector of power. I always hear executives say things like, oh, everyone wants time with me. Everyone wants to get on my calendar. Everything can't come through me. And the reality is that if you are only getting your context built by the same three people all of the time, then you're also not being equitable in your distribution of power. Like you've got to really get full context. And you just cannot do that if there isn't clarity about who holds what. And I find a lot that one of the holdovers of homogenous institution culture, folks often don't want to make decisions. They want someone else to make it for them. So even distributing power is hard, right? Because you give people the decision, which is like you giving them power, which they have asked for. And they're like, oh, I don't want to do that because they also are like, have this fantasy of power, right? So
Mhm.
they give the decision making rights back. But it's really like having power is a skill and using power is a skill like any other skill, right? And if people do not have clarity about who has decision making rights on what, then you have, again, insulation of power, right? People can make a bunch of decisions in the dark and blame someone else for them.
Mhm.
Like that's the holdover, right? Where it's like, oh, the board made me do it. Oh, the lawyers said I have to do X, Y, or Z. Like there's always someone else to blame for
Yep.
that. And that means that power can stay hidden in all of the crevices instead of being clear to everyone about who's responsible for what.
That makes me think about how some of the most dangerous leaders are those who hold power but aren't aware of it or refuse to recognize it. And you call this
Absolutely.
the who me, like the who me, I have power, like moment or leader. And if anyone's listening who's had that who me moment, to offer some like grace and
I would
self-reflection.
never.
Right, right. And also, there's more people who are in down power positions. Mm. So I'm thinking about the question to ask here. And on the one hand, it's like, one, how do we bring awareness to people who hold power and, yeah, are like, I would never, or who me? I don't have power. How to help folks develop awareness, especially because the people who are seeing or being impacted by their lack of awareness are often in down power positions who have more risk with their jobs, for example.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering what works to bring awareness to people in more up level
Yeah.
positions.
Well, I honestly think even that decision making rights work helps those people because they understand the scope of their impact in a lot better of a way, right? And I like it's kind of like a cannonball at a pool. The more power you have, your splash zone is just much bigger. How much power you have determines how big your splash zone is. Your Aversion to conflict becomes an entire institution's aversion to conflict. Inability to make decisions becomes the entire slowdown. If you are unwilling to hold people accountable for something, then it becomes the abusive environment that you are creating as a person with power. And that's hard, right? It's
Mm.
hard to be that responsible. But we have this image of power that it's like luxury
Mm.
instead of responsibility. And it's really responsibility. I tell folks often that I think we have three different relationships to power. One is power as trophy. These are like the power heat seeking missiles that are like, I see it, I'm going to go get it, I'm going to take it. And we're all going to cheer once we think that's
Mm.
a power trophy relationship. Then there's power as enemy. Power as enemy is very much suspicious of power in every single presentation of it, reactivity to power in a lot of different ways. It cannot be trusted and is suspicious no matter what. And then there is power as spatula, which is like, I use a spatula to flip my pancakes and make my eggs. I use power to do this for my people. It's only as good as its usefulness, which is a much less primal relationship to power than trophy and enemy. And I think that a lot of folks who have had difficulty navigating power go into having power with a power as enemy relationship. And their identity has been so baked on, like, I'm here to fight the man, that they never notice when they become the man. And that is toxifying for an institution. Like, you have to understand when you have power. Otherwise, everything that you're doing is reaction. And I don't think there is a right relationship to power either. Often people be like, I'm power spatula. Oh my gosh, power spatula all day, every day. And that's just not human. Like, sometimes it's power as spatula, sometimes it's power as trophy, sometimes it's power as enemy. What I would advocate is for us to be intentional about which relationship we're having to power in a given moment so that we can utilize each of those lenses to manage the great responsibility of the ability to change other people's lives. Yeah.
Seems like they align very much with an understanding of attachment wounds and strategies.
Yes.
In attachment, there's more anxious, like perhaps
Yes.
might show more clingy, more avoidant. And then
Yeah.
there's also disorganized. I think a lot of organizers get into this disorganized attachment place with power, which is like a come here, go away, like brakes and pedal at the same time. Like, of
Yes.
course, we long for collective power. And
Yes.
when we don't name that and make it explicit, it's kind of in the shadow and we can't work with it, right? There's a longing
Yeah.
for it. And then there's a deep fear. And so
Yeah.
it's like a pedal break, enemy trophy, enemy trophy,
Yes.
right? And then we get very stuck. And
Yeah.
so, like you said, it's not like, oh, I am secure all the time, because no, we live in a disorganized like
Yeah.
overculture and moment. So of course we're gonna feel dysregulated. So, but let's
Yeah.
get intentional. Let's take all of this out of the shadow and work to be aware of our relationship.
I think it's important to say that there is a segregationist project in America. And
Yes.
that segregationist project is working very hard to take power from us before we fully step into all of our power. And that segregationist project has really bought up all access to information and where and how we access information. And it is Cruelty Content Inc. And
Mm.
it is trying to make all of us utilize our own power from a place of our amygdala and reactivity and protectiveness. And if the segregationist project is trying at every single level to make us make decisions and manage power from our amygdala and our reactivity center, then it has to be our project to pull each other back into our frontal lobe and to make choiceful, intentional decisions.
So you can choose whether to go here or not.
Yeah.
And what comes up for me when I hear you say that is like, what is holding you in these times? I mean, you have long COVID, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
you have lived through the fires. There's the National Guard showing up and all of the raids. I've been there one day in my life, but LA has been in my heart. And I'm wondering, just wanting to,
Yeah,
it's a lot.
absolutely. The thing that has kept me going is watching my community fight back in organized and spontaneous ways. I had to evacuate my house. The smoke had gotten so high that, like, my house was not inhabitable for months. I watched my city put together distribution centers for people who had lost their homes. I watched the Day Laborers Network go and help people clean out places,
Mm.
take ash off the street, take the debris away so that people were not re traumatized just walking down the street. I watched unions for self defense pop up. People who'd been doing organizing for a really long time were ready for this moment. Then the raids start to happen, and I watch my community members go on the street and demand differently, highlight the stories, insist on something different. And that doesn't make the abuse any less,
No.
honestly. In some cases, it made the abuse much more violent, and people refused. I know so many people impacted by all of this, and no one stood down. And it's the height of an abuse of power to say you
Yeah.
have power and to stand down right now. If you have power right now, you are obligated to use it. And I think part of what I'm really clear about right now is that we have made healthy organization or equitable organization or healthy democracy a utopia we will have someday.
Mm.
And we treat it like heaven at the end of a long battle. And I have no interest actually in waiting to create a healthy future. I want to create a healthy present. And that means I do that in the institutions I am a part of. And it means I do that in the family I'm a part of. It means I do that in all of the places that I impact because I'm fighting for a present that everyone can be a part of, not a future that may someday happen or not happen.
It does take it to the local, right? It is absolutely possible to show up now in ways with the groups and families and organizations and spaces and towns, cities, etc. We can show up in the ways that we need to.
Here's the thing, people learn how to be together across difference inside of institutions. It does not happen in civics class, it happens at the soccer league. It's about how people experience sharing power in those places. And that trains us in an expectation of what we should have in a democracy. And we have very little expectations of our democracy right now. We have very few expectations of what should be done in our broader collective, but we can create those.
Y'all posted a post a couple of weeks ago about a dance in LA.
Yeah,
I have been dancing so much this year. That's my like, commitment to
yeah,
myself. And like how power is shared in that, at the New City Brewery in East Hampton, Massachusetts from
yeah,
9 p.m. to
absolutely.
midnight, or thinking about co-parenting. And how do we share power here? Or,
Yeah.
it's in all the
It's
little ways, right?
it's
Yeah,
at the school board meeting.
exactly. It
It's
is at
at
the
the
school board
city.
meeting,
Yeah.
the city
It's at
council
the
meeting.
it's
Hmm.
at the library,
Yeah.
you know. It's all of those places. And we get to. Not we have to, we get to create something different.
And both we get to, and also, like you've said, we have an obligation and a responsibility to do it now if
If
we
we
wield
have
that
power, we
power. Right.
absolutely do.
People's like wheels are turning around the spaces in which they currently operate and show up. What are steps? I mean, everyone's context is different, right? But how do
Yeah.
we start?
I don't know why I feel like doing this with the soccer league today, but
Cool.
I
Right
just
on.
think that it's the most accessible. Like, if you say you have a soccer league or a baseball team or what have you, and you want to get all of the parents together to be like, what do we believe is the best environment for kids to learn and grow in this sport, right? Like, what do we believe as a group? And do work to define those beliefs. So it's like, hey, we think a positive environment gets the most results out of kids. We think that a place where any child can turn to any adult to get counsel is like the best place for this. It's parents who can talk to each other about difficulties happening in the team, right? Say those are the three beliefs that you have.
Sure.
And then you are like, okay, then what does it mean for us to live out those beliefs and be in alignment with those and to not live out those beliefs and be in alignment with those? And like, oh, that means at the games, parents are responsible for cheering on the team, and living out of alignment is saying something abusive or coercive to the child. And here are the examples of that, right? It's if two parents are having beef, they are required to go and handle that beef off the field, right? If we are having issues with the coach, we take a team vote on blah, blah, blah. What are your beliefs and what are the behaviors that you as a group are going to agree on for those beliefs? And what are the trade offs you willingly make because you know living to those beliefs is important? That means sometimes I'm going to feel like being emotionally messy. And at this soccer field, I do not get to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a trade off I'm willing to make for this environment for our kids. How do you start to pull people into conversations where they get to imagine the kind of world that they want to build? And then they are specific about the behaviors that create that world.
Mm-hmm. And then what are the processes around accountability and
And
repair?
then what are the
Mm-hmm.
processes around accountability and repair that get you there?
Okay.
If you can do that at that level,
Yeah.
people start to do that at many other levels.
Right. And we can do that.
And
And we
we
get to do
can.
it now.
We get
Yeah.
to do it.
Yeah. If a listener is grappling with conflict in their workplace, in
Mm,
their community group,
yeah.
in organizing work, any other last things that you would want them to know?
Oh, man. I always tell folks that all of our collectives should have conflict charters, like how we handle conflict before we are in conflict. It's like the conflict prenup for a
Yeah.
collective. So I think one, you want to create those so that you have agreements around how you're going to deal with conflict together before you ever do that. And if you're already in it, I just think it's very rare to be able to come out of repetitive conflict without support because everyone gets locked into their lens and then there's only one right way and it's like my way or the highway thinking happens a lot. And often I think we're looking for like trained mediators and facilitators to do that. And listen, like I am one. So like clearly
Mm-hmm.
um I see value in that. But I also think it's like having someone who can reflect back to you what they're seeing in any given moment in time
Mm-hmm.
and what the I hesitate to say impartial because actually we want folks who are partial, but partial to the culture that you're trying to create more than they are to any one given person. And how do those people just do a good job of reflecting back? Like, here's what I'm seeing. Here's what we can handle inside of this conflict. Here's what I actually think each of you would need to go do your own work on in
Mm-hmm.
order to really work on this. What does repair look like here? What does redress look like here? Sometimes I think we hold forgiveness as an idol, and you can do a lot of things with people you don't forgive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I go to the Universalist Unitarian Church, and we had a lay-led ministry in LA, UULA, and we had a speaker this weekend talked about he's way less interested in people creating communities than creating coalitions,
Hmm.
because coalition means we are negotiating each other's differences and negotiating our goals. And community usually demands sameness and like a similar set of experiences and a similar set of concerns. And it demands a certain cultural deference. And coalition means like, you're different than me. I don't get you, but I'm still going to negotiate with you because your humanity is that important to me. When two parties are both invested in that, there's so much you can do together. His name was Dr. Chris Goff.
If we were to look at it, it's like the community is kind of a mess, whereas the coalition is a web of nodes that are all
Yep.
showing up for the collective. And
I just thought it was such a good, it was so good. I was like
yeah,
fist pumping in my seat.
yeah, yeah, me too. All right. So if folks want to learn more from you, how do they do that?
Yeah. They can follow me on LinkedIn. They can follow Brava Leaders, my company on LinkedIn. We put out a bi-monthly newsletter, so they can come and do that. I am going to launch a Beehive newsletter personally. So our Brava Leaders newsletter will always be focused on institutions, and I'm going to do my own newsletter soon that
Mm.
focuses on the relationship between our institutions and democracy. You can also follow my social on Instagram or Blue Sky, Karla Liliana on Blue Sky. On Instagram, I'm Carlita Liliana or Brava Leaders. You can follow us there as well.
Well, I have gotten so much out of following you on LinkedIn, and I strongly encourage anyone and everyone who has felt inspired and lit up and learning things from this conversation to go and follow you on one of those platforms because it's been a real gift. So thank
Thank
you. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me. If you loved this conversation and want to hear more, I invite you to do three things. First, go to the Conflict Decoded show page wherever you listen to podcasts and tap the plus sign or click on follow. That way, you'll be the first to hear my new episodes and I will get to share them with you. Second, while you're there, if you would be willing to give the podcast a 5-star review or share it with a friend, I would be very grateful. And finally, if you are eager to receive the latest episodes by email, along with other morsels of guidance to support you and your work in the world, I invite you to subscribe to my Saturday Love Letters to Changemakers. To do this, visit callingsandcourage.com/subscribe. Thank you for listening. Until next time, take good care.